You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. I am your host, Danny Ashes, and I am here with the other host, Trey, as well. Before we get started, I kind of want to say at the beginning of this episode that we are going to be sharing our interpretation of the ideas presented in this book, along with our opinions on the theories and frameworks and anecdotes presented therein. And thinking about this episode, I realized that I don't express on the show very often that my opinions are meant to just be my opinions, because I feel like that's kind of implied. But I think that sometimes I can sound overly confident when talking about theory or things I'm interested in, which I'm going to be doing more towards the end of this episode. So I wanted to just kind of emphasize at the beginning that my experience and my research and my knowledge is a mishmash of an autodidact, basically. I'm not an expert on philosophy or sociology. I don't have any formal training. These are just interests of mine, and they very likely could be misinterpretations of things that I've read or of this book or what other systems of critique and analysis and things. So I don't want to come off like I'm right about everything. And my goal is more to share my views, kind of hopefully entertain, be interesting, but more importantly, I think spur you to think in new ways, to think about these topics as they relate to you, and maybe to challenge you to explore your assumptions and the conditions of the possibility of those conceptions, as Kant would say. See, I'm already throwing in the spirit of being critical. Don't replace anything I say with your own study, with expert lectures and academic papers and that kind of thing. So with that out of the way, we are going to be talking on this episode about the content of the book Italian Goth Subculture, Kindred Creatures, and Other Dark Enactments by Simone Tassoni and Emanuela Zuccalla. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing those names correctly, but that's my best try. And the way I want to kind of structure this episode is to walk through the book in a mostly chronological way, but to also share the main themes and stories of the book and our opinions on that substance. I think an episode where we just share what is in the book is a bit too close to copyright infringement and also less interesting to listen to. So if you do find our thoughts or the content of the book interesting, I highly recommend that you buy the book if you are able. I know I really enjoyed it. I will say my biggest complaint about the book is the Italian version has a lot of drawings and photos of Italian goths and punks, and there's like photocopies of flyers and zines and that kind of thing. And none of that is in the English version for some reason. But the English version also has stuff that's not in the Italian version, which was called Creature Simuli.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. That's actually really disappointing because, like you said, the book is good, but yeah, it would have been great to have some visuals of the flyers they're referencing or the looks they're referencing, especially when it's talking about the various subcultures and subcultures and their interactions. And there's a lot of talk of performativity and enactment and display. Mm-hmm. And the only thing I can relate that to is what I know from what I've seen here in the US and or in other books that discuss primarily the US, the UK, and a bit of Germany. So very limited when it comes to a potential spectrum of enactment.
Yeah, only found that out a few days ago when I watched a Italian goth YouTuber with auto-generated captions talking about the Creature Simuli version from a year and a half ago, I think. And they brought that up. And I'll have that linked in the show notes as well. I know last episode we had pretty extensive references, and I'll have more references in here for anything we bring up. Yeah. So for me, going off of that, the most interesting part of the book for me was thinking about the conceptual and theory side of it. And that, I think, is the direction I come at when analyzing this book, and probably I'll try and save most of it for the end, but a good chunk of what I want to talk about is that kind of thing. But that actually caused me to reflect a bit on how we structure the actual podcast, Cemetery Confessions, in general, because I know for a few years I really tried to steer the podcast in a highly academic direction, and a lot of people took issue with that, which I think is completely fair. So the tone of the show in the last couple years has been different to previous years. But since the podcast is also an expression of my own passion, I kind of wanted to have at least one episode where I can pull out the turgid academic jargon, is my favorite phrase to reference that, and kind of talk about that. But that said, I'm still kind of two minds about that, because the book also goes in two directions. It is a dense academic analysis, but I think what would be most interesting for most people is the extensive sharing of stories and experiences from the Italian darks, that's the term they use for goth, basically. So we'll be using that going forward, of their experiences in the 80s. So the ethnographic interviews they did, they put huge chunks of text from those interviews in the book. And I think most people will find that interesting. But there is a lot of theory and referencing academic books and papers. It might be worth noting that the very beginning of the book starts with an anecdote about Milano punks protesting an academic conference about subculture. And that kind of reminded me of some of the comments I've seen on past Cemetery Confessions episodes about people having a distaste for intellectualizing goth. For me, though, I think academic discussion around subculture is more than just a philosophical study, and it's not like an attempt to sound smart or anything. For me, it kind of comes back to the endlessly fascinating nature of existence and the ways in which that enables us to live better lives and to support those around us. So Trey, I know you've brought up arguments around the need for accessibility of academic thought, and how the lack of that can be classist and ableist. And I've seen some people say that if you can't explain it, maybe you even said this, if you can't explain it in a way everyone understands, you maybe don't even understand the concepts yourself. And I think that originally, is all true.
It might have been an Einstein quote, but it's basically, if you can't describe a topic in a way like a 6-year-old can understand, then your understanding of it is probably flawed.
Okay, sure. Yeah, which I honestly, mine very well could be. And I don't have any good defense for what is coming in this episode, other than to just say I enjoy parsing information this way. This is just the one episode. I do try and break down what I think are the core concepts of these philosophical discussions in accessible language in other episodes. And also, it's just like, I want to be a nerd. I just want to be a nerd for one episode. So try and stay with me. Hopefully it's not too terrible. So that's my disclaimer. So with that, the first 2 chapters of this book are basically a wide-ranging look at previous academic literature on goth. And I think I mentioned something similar when we talked about the Evolution of Goth book, because they did something similar. But I loved these, especially the first chapter, because it hits all the high notes of the subcultural studies that I've read and kind of talked about here and there on the podcast over the years, but in a very focused way. So it was fun for me to hear other people talk about those same things that I've read kind of on my own and haven't really discussed with people so much. And I do like I said, I'm going to save most of the theory, my thoughts on the theory, towards the second half of the episode. But I do want to quickly mention a few of the academics and their theories that they reference in the book to provide a little bit of context to previous literature on subculture and cultural ontology that gives some flavor to the book. And then once we have talked about the information from the interviewees, that's when I want to try and connect the theory to what they talked about. And also, it's worth pointing out, they bring these authors up, but they don't agree with all of them. They just kind of references, like, here are some ways other academics have tried to explain things that we're going to talk about. I'm going to try and summarize just a few of the important ones. They reference Bourdieu's habitus. That is essentially the way that socialized norms or tendencies that guide behavior and thinking are integrated into people's lives. So here's a quote. Habitus is the way society becomes deposited in persons in the form of lasting dispositions or trained capacities and structured propensities to think, feel, and act in determinate ways, which then guide them. And then importantly, those, end quote, those are not fixed, and that interplay of agents and structures also relies on influence from environment and context. They mention Spracklin's communicative alternativity, which comes from the book that we also reviewed previously. We did talk about that in the book, but again, just to briefly summarize, Spracklin is a structuralist a la Marx and the Frankfurt School. And communicative alternativity is the idea that Goth is transgressive and never becomes normal or acceptable. And that's something I have a problem with, but we'll come back to that later. He does try and balance that out with some postmodernist theorists, but again, this doesn't really come up in this book, so it's not really worth talking about. One of the more relevant theories, though, is Hodkinson's 4 markers of subculture. And these are actually what kind of spurred me to create my homology hypothesis, which I meant to use as a sociological framework for explaining what goth is. But to briefly explain his 4 markers of subculture, which have been really widely commented on in sociology. The first one is let's go with consistent distinctiveness, which is the one they talk about most in this book. That essentially means the values and tastes of goth are diverse and changeable to a degree, but also sufficiently distinctive and consistent between time and place, which enables participants to distinguish between insider and outsider. The second one is identity, which for Hodkinson is a shared sense of affiliation and collective distinction, which is prominent in an overall sense of identity. And Tissoni and Zakala mention that they think this is a fairly weak and unspecific identity theory, which I agree with. Third is commitment, essentially meaning being goth tended to dominate the leisure time, social lives, and consumption habits of members. And then fourth was autonomy, meaning goods, services, and business was independent and produced by and focused on the goth community, which forms an interconnected structure. They bring up Muggleton's middle ground theoretical framework. I've recommended his book a couple times on the podcast, I think. And that basically attempts to split the difference between the semiotic interpretations of the CCCS and the neo-tribal theory of Maffesoli. Basically, though, his main point is that he wants ethnographic researchers to place an emphasis in their methodology on the subjective experience of the subculturalists, rather than a more top-down theoretical approach when trying to understand subculture. And then I think the last big one is that they reference Dunja Brill and her book that kind of critiques gender in goth subculture, which we've both talked about before and why we don't like that. I'll bring that up, though, later in the book when it's more relevant. And then, yeah, they reference like a whole bunch of other people. Van Elfren, Gavin Badelli, Catherine Spooner, Natasha Scharf, and Christina Golding are the ones that I think have specifically written about goth. But they also reference like a whole ton of other people. And my God, Trey, the footnotes in this book. I don't think I have a book with this many footnotes. It's extensive in references.
It's quite a list.
They're pages after some of these chapters. I mean, which is wonderful. Like, they absolutely did their homework. This isn't a book where they are, outsiders talking about goth and getting it completely wrong because they have no conception of what it's like to be a goth. They really did their due diligence, I think. So those are the theorists, and then they sort of introduce what I think is the main focus of the book, which are their 3 enactments, as a way to explain how darks equals goth, basically, how darks organized and formed subcultures. So for the authors, an enactment is, quote, being the performative process in which something is actualized in the world through different practices, unquote. I really like this theory. I do think that saying there are only 3, even if you're limiting it to historical context, is a bit arbitrary, but again, I'm not going to analyze that necessarily right now. The 3 enactments, though, are, the first one is the activists. Those are darks whose focus is on forms of political engagement. The second enactment are club scene darks, or club scene enactments. Those were people who were more hedonist and focused on social engagement. And then the third are loner enactments. Those are darks who formed their identity around the consumption of literature and music and curating an individual identity rather than a communal one. And then, like I mentioned, these are kind of linked to Hodkinson's consistent distinctiveness. And the way they kind of talk about this is to say that these 3 enactments are based in a specific historical context and specific socioeconomic conditions, and those did influence the way these enactments came to be and allowed them to be diverse or heterogeneous, but they are still recognizable to goths outside of Italy. So basically, these are meant to explore how goth can be understood or defined in different ways while still being considered goth. So maybe for some darks, the core of being a dark is activism, and for some it's being social. So they're trying to show there isn't a fixed semantic definition of goth, and maybe that sounds wrong for some people, and I know I've heard people argue that there is, like, this is how you define goth, but we're going to try and do a deep dive into what that means, what this means, how it functions, how it fits into understanding and defining goth. And then to close out, they kind of push against the semiotic traditions of the CCCS. So I brought this up briefly. This was like one of the main schools of sociology to study subculture. Specifically, they talk about Hebdige, who was one of the theorists there. I think some people kind of tend to homogenize that school of thought as just one specific focus, whereas there was a pretty diverse body of literature. But essentially, Hebdige's semiotic framework modeled identity as fixed and expressed through specific meaning of various objects and symbols. So youth culture and the symbols of the youth culture function as a subversive a subversion of dominant culture. So you can understand the ideology of punk, for example, by studying the way signs and symbols are used by the working class to subvert dominant expectation. They do also, though, take issue with the postmodernist approaches like neo-tribes, which I mentioned. Those essentially understand subcultural identities as being transient and multiplicitous. So you move from one idea to the next without any real commitment to one or the other. They draw on a lot of free-floating signifiers that lack a coherence. So their approach then is they talk about taking a holistic biographical approach when analyzing subculture, meaning they take into account the local, social, economic, and political conditions, gender, cultural production and consumption practices, style, and socialization, which I also like. And then here's the last actual thing. The main big backbone of their theory is Ted Schotsky, who is a social ontologist or practice theorist, however he calls it. He calls his theory site ontology. He's written prolifically. I actually spent quite a lot of time trying to listen to some lectures and read little bits and pieces here, read some summaries of his work and that kind of thing to understand where they're coming from. So they and I'll talk about this more at length later, but he basically seeks to break down the ideas of a distinction of social structures at one end of the spectrum and then individual action at the other. So he's like I and you, opposed to dichotomies between many of these things that we talk about. So yeah, that'll come up later. Okay, enough of that. Chapter 3. I don't have many thoughts on this. It is a short chapter, too. It kind of sets the scene of the political climate in the 80s. It talks about the politics and political action of subculture in Milan, which is where this is called Italian Goth Subculture, but they focus mostly on northern Italy, specifically Milan. They talk about how Milan emerged as a kind of neoliberal wet dream in 87 and how the government tried to eradicate leftism through massive police crackdowns on political dissidents, which also made everyone who looked remotely out of the ordinary, so goths, punks, they mentioned breakdancers and rockabillys, any alternative youth were harassed by the police. The punks specifically would stage protests, and there was this pull and push between them and the cops, where the cops would try and arrest them before they even had the chance to do any kind of protest. They try to set the story of Milan subculture by grounding it in a resistance against the bourgeoisie and through political action. And this activism of subculture becomes a reference point through the rest of the books, in some ways as a way to talk about how darks thought differently about this than punks and other groups, as they were all kind of trying to find their voice and the meaning of their community through the 80s. It's not really the main focus of the book, but there is certainly it is a major consideration, largely not even because of the authors. It was just kind of brought up through the interviews.
Yeah, basically I'm sort of got the same thing. The main thing I took away from it is that, as described in this book, Milan in the 80s was not especially dissimilar. In fact, it is very similar to what I've heard of and what I partially experienced in the US in the 80s and in the UK in the 80s, and basically a lot of the nations that were involved in World War II. It's kind of a continuing backlash of the socioeconomic changes that were spurred on by that global war, and sort of a backlash against the 60s and 70s, which were a backlash against the prosperity of the 50s following the post-war era, and kind of the pendulum swinging back and forth. So the 80s were described here as a pendulum back towards nationalism, back towards being very pro your home state and the power of the state, and the importance of appearances in determining where you are on that spectrum, whether you were with the state, with the nation, or whether you were a subversive element. And a lot of that did boil down to superficial appearances, which I think has two sides here. One, like you mentioned with the crackdowns, it's definitely a a way to at least believe you're pre-seeing or being able to foretell subversive elements and crack down on them easily as an outsider because they look weird. But at the same point, from the side of the subversives, from the side of the punks or darks of the activist enactment, why there was such an emphasis with its extravagant appearance as a way to perform their activism by sticking it to the man, by sticking it to the normies or the people who think Milan is for sipping and are just into the very superficial, pleasure-seeking, hedonistic consumerism that is sort of the hallmark of the 80s as we look back on it today. It's the stereotype of what the 80s in the global quote-unquote West is kind of known for. And Milan, Italy in general, but Milan in specific per the book, weren't that distinct in that.
Yeah. So then we move into chapter 4, which is where a lot of the meat of the book, I guess, is as far as information from the interviewees. And the way I have this split is through the 3 different enactments. So the first one is the activist enactment, the second one is the club enactment, and the third are loner enactments. So I guess I'll just start with my thoughts, kind of describing what they're talking about with the activist enactment. And this kind of describes the formation of punk resistance rather than dark specifically, though there was a lot of intermingling, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's laying the groundwork for the existence of punk and the intermingling, but also some of the major points of contention, which kind of were spurred, or which kind of, I think, spurred the genesis of goth itself, in that we're different, and some of their enactments, I think, were in response to these conflicts with punk and with that sort of hugely political activist mindset.
Yeah. So we get a lot of anecdotes about punk resistance to the system, which basically meant any system that they felt was oppressive. There wasn't really a formalized leftist ideology necessarily. It wasn't like they were all Marxist or something. It was just kind of an ethos of destroy the system and subvert the norm. But you do get lots of growing support for veganism and advocating for the environment and some form of class resistance. There was a lot of talk about fighting for the right to take up space in the world. Physical spaces and ideological spaces, to kind of be able to co-construct the reality that they wanted to live in. And that's where the virus comes in, which was this collective punk space that, as far as from what I understood, functioned as a squat and a place to hold concerts.
I think they called it a squat on several instances. Seemed very similar to a lot of the descriptions of the UK scene as well. Some of the Manchester and Bristol scenes, the working class squats. Basically, people were working odd jobs, but kind of homeless, but finding a space to occupy.
So in talking about what the enactment meant insofar as the ways they understood their subculture, Tassoni and Zakala talk about dichotomizing between the perceived authentic internal subculture and the mainstream, which is the abstracted other. And they talk about how the substance of the style, music, and cultural consumption would always come back to political action. So those who participated in other aspects of the scene without a dedication to the political end of it were who would be called a poser. That's how they sort of delineated that. And they say this is largely brought about because of the socio-political situation at the time. So punk bands that were overtly anti-fascist and anarchistic were what became popular. And the more esoteric goth bands from the UK, for example, were less popular. And the political action that they took generally, but other than protests, was this sort of like violent direct action. So they were living in squats, they were doing non-violent things like handing out flyers and protesting and that kind of thing. But they had this sort of angry ethic for a while of no future. And I think, as you were alluding to, Trey, this kind of thing became tiring over the years, and that's when you start to get the UK post-punk scene starts to seep in with the theatrical and the existential thought and the sexual transgression, that kind of thing. Interestingly, I think one of the interviewees mentions how it was an easy broadening of scope from the activist enactment, since movements like Dadaism and Surrealism shared many similarities with anarchism, which is nice to see because that's something I've heard from like UK goth musicians of the 80s and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then the band CCCP becomes an example of that move. They were a post-punk band that blended punk with traditional Italian folk and melodic post-punk sounds, including, I think this is a quote from the book, including a drum machine. They escaped the harsh dichotomy of punk and sang about religion, alternative sources of meaning, philosophy, history, psychological disorders, fatalism, anime, and the human condition. And as a side note, I did write down a list of every Italian specific dark or punk band that was brought up. So I will put that in the show notes as well if you're interested in sort of like hearing, what kind of music were they listening to? Obviously the UK bands people were listening to them, and they come up a lot in the book. But I tried to catch all the Italian specific bands that I hadn't heard of, certainly, and you may not have as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about, you were doing some comparison of the Italian subculture to places like the UK. I was thinking about that as well as like the death rock scene in LA.
Yeah, I was mostly just thinking, a lot of this rang very similar to when I was reading, both watching and reading, depending on, but the movie 24-Hour Party People, from the birth of post-punk around Joy Division and that stuff, but also from the Cosi fan tutti book that I read about, growing up in the scene and the foundation of Throbbing Gristle, and some of that also within that same post-punk melting pot within the UK. There's a lot of similar themes of a lot of people living in squats, doing odd jobs and being creative in their free time, creating musical happenings and art projects along with protest and political activism, having ideological conflicts with skinheads and mods and rockabillys, and the same sort of themes that I've seen in these other narratives just continue to come up, which is, I found very interesting, because these places were so geologically or geographically separate.
Yeah.
And that there wasn't the internet back then. There wasn't this easy means. That's not to say there was no means, because there was a very strong zine and epistolary tradition that they mentioned in the book also, and tape trading and all of this stuff that did lead to a surprising amount of international communication within these subcultures, despite not having the internet like we are used to now. But I did find it very interesting how similar these descriptions were, with similar strains between the subcultures, similar underlying reasons for those subcultures to exist, and items that they're fighting against or norms that they're fighting against. So I really found it intriguing how familiar this seemed to me from other things, which I guess in hindsight it shouldn't have been. We aren't dealing with a wildly foreign cultural basis. We're dealing with cultures that had very similar economic, cultural, sociological ties with each other, historical ties, similar traumas that they're dealing with. Yeah, and as far as the CCCP thing, I did enjoy that. Your quote was pretty accurate. One thing that I wanted to address, you kind of mentioned it, but it did say that, the shows were theatrical and standalone expressions of the band, which didn't actively include the audience, which was a big distinction between Dark Enactment when it came to music performance and Punk Enactment, where Punk Enactment was very much a rally. It was a way for the band to fire up the audience to go out and protest. And so there was call and response and chants and intermingling and jumping out to the audience and jumping into mosh pits and going out pogoing. There wasn't a separation between band on stage, given this place of primacy, and the audience. It was much more this sort of egalitarian of the people kind of thing, which definitely went along with those leftist policies or politics that they were espousing. Whereas, and this is almost certainly one of the many points of contention between punk and dark enactment, the dark bands were very keen on their personal artistic expression, which couldn't be involving, well, I can't say couldn't because there were plenty of examples of bands in history that did still include the audience, but the way they were enacting it here was excluding the audience. The audience were observers, while the band were the performers, the actors doing the enactment, which can be felt as disenfranchising, disempowering, and all of that, especially if what they're expressing was something foreign or even counterproductive. And it did mention that some of the things that were particularly affronting to the punks were when we were getting into some sexuality and gender issues with bands performing with, nude male bodies, which has a homoerotic sense. And that is something that there was a lot of antipathy towards in the punk scene. Kind of was the stem of why punk hated disco so much. At least in the US, because that was more of a US thing, the disco destruction, because disco stayed pretty popular through most of Europe, to my knowledge. I don't know if there was a similar backlash, but I've only heard about the severe backlash here, and a lot of that was homophobic and racist, but the homophobia is what comes in here for the most part. But also the performativity being with playing around with gender, with makeup, and that theatricality being effeminate and not this masculine fight down with the man kind of enactment that was the norm in punk. So there was a lot of things that were affronting punk, both from the sensibilities as what it is to be a punk, as well as the sensibilities of what is to be involved versus a subject, whether to be empowered or subjugated. And having the idea that you're subjugating your identity to a performance is exactly what punks were fighting against. And I can see that being a real bad sticking point, and why there was so much antipathy and why things did devolve frequently into violence, though rarely to casualties. Well, injuries, I guess, are casualties, but no deaths, or rare death.
Well, there were even disagreements from within the punk scene. They mentioned briefly, at least, that there were women splitting off to form their own communities outside of the virus, because they were talking about how it was very sexist, and women were kind of minimized and relegated to non-important tasks, and there was a lot of there was some abuse and things like that going on. And so they were like, there's so that's where a lot of feminist groups started, because they're like, there's this inherent what's the word I'm looking for, not irony, but where you're talking about leftism as a uniting of the working class, and yet you're treating women like second-class citizens.
Right. It's kind of the sense in a lot of I guess activist or protest movements where you fight against the people above you and do the same thing they were doing to you to the people you consider below you, whether it is by gender, race, sexuality, disability status, whatever that is. There's a lot of this shit rolls downhill, and there's a sense sometimes in people who view themselves as victims that their self-worth comes from, well, I'm being shit on from above, but at least I'm better than these other people.
Yeah.
And that gives me a sense of worth.
Of power, yeah.
Yeah, it's worth and power when you feel helpless.
Yeah.
It's comforting, though unhealthy as a society, but it's comforting to feel you have power over something, and even more so that you have power over someone. Because you feel that it's only fair that if I'm getting shit on, I should be able to shit on somebody else. The eye for an eye kind of thing that, makes the world blind.
Yeah. They also mention the Hysterica, which they compare to the Batcave in London, because it was kind of famous for being open-minded and catering to queer clientele, which they say was unusual even in dark and alternative spaces. Oh, this was funny. Another similarity that they brought up was interviewees talking about, I think this comes up later as well, talking about weekenders in a sort of pejorative roundabout way, where
that definitely comes up, especially in the isolationist, the loner enactment is where that really hits a fever pitch. But yeah, it was hitting all of them.
Where they say that liken them to people who would come to the club and say that they felt like they finally fit in, and then a few weeks later would be out of the scene dressing like everyone else. So that's just a little bit of a preview to later, as you mentioned. I did love the stories around community building, though. A couple I thought of was one person talked about a girl asking him for eyeliner in the bathroom, and then they ended up chatting. One of them invited the other to a different subcultural space they hadn't heard of before, which is really like that magic of community interaction that I love. It's the sort of bonding with people around a shared sense of identity. There was another one where a woman was going to the Hysterica for the first time, and I think she was on the subway, and another girl approached her and asked, "Oh, are you going to the Hysterica? You looked like you are." And then they kind of became friends. But the first woman had never been there. So then they'd go through this sort of like, let's try and figure out how to get there together.
Yeah, they both had never been there. And the one that was approaching the other one was going as if the person she was approaching was this experienced person who could help guide her. And they found out, nope, they're both pretty much first timers, but hey, let's do it together. Two heads are better than one.
Cute. Yeah.
It is very cute. Yeah, I loved some of their stories about travel too, where they're talking about people who, were maybe big in the Milan scene because that's where a lot of this focused, but then would go out to Tunis or some other area, some other Turin, some other area in Italy, and would be there were enough similarities to feel a little comfortable, but there was like a personality of each area because things were so disparate and so different, and travel was not quite so ubiquitous, so every scene sort of developed its own flavor. And then there were the people who would scene hop and have that experience of multiple different scenes, and understanding, okay, I'm an insider here, but I'm an outsider there, and how do we navigate that? And I thought some of those stories were really interesting.
Yeah. And then just to mention, before we do club enactments, they do bring up zines. I don't have a lot of notes on them, but they talk about how there were a lot of different zines. They were all like sort of handmade and photocopied, either made to order or handed out on the street or at clubs. The biggest zine was called Amen, which was printing in the thousands, I believe. And so this is, obviously that's one of the main ways that they were able to disseminate information and create these sort of cultural touchstones for darks.
One thing I wanted to mention, which was an interesting cultural difference that was to a degree a distinction between my experience of the US and UK scenes, or at least my experience, and then the secondhand hearing other stories of it, was the reaction towards use of iconography, especially offensive iconography that was very common in punk, and also was grabbed onto early on in goth as well. But the use of the ironic postmodern utilization of things like the swastika or SS symbols or military uniforms or stuff like that was pretty popular in the UK and the US. And the greater society of the US and the UK view it as insulting, but not quite this existential thing. They kind of, it's just kids being kids and they're being stupid. Whereas in Italy and also in Germany, but in this book, they were primarily talking about Italy, it was viewed as a massive, massive problem. And there was fairly draconian repercussions to that sort of thing because those symbols had such greater meaning to states which were under the sway of said fascistic, nationalistic forces. Mm-hmm. So those symbols had extra resonance, kind of similar to how in the US today we have things like the stars and bars and blackface and stuff like that is taken much more seriously when enacted here, especially on the blackface side of things. But in France or England, something like blackface isn't as affronting because it wasn't such a cultural tinderbox in those nations as it is here. And it was just interesting to see that reflected, the zero tolerance policy towards wearing a swastika in Italy. And I've also heard in Germany, because I know they had a long, there was a large anti-fascistic move in the government to kind of get away from that. Mm-hmm. Because they did do a good job, I think, from what I've heard, Germany did a good job of owning up to their mistakes and saying, yeah, we did some shitty things and we need to atone for that. And if you start playing around with that, no, that's not okay.
Yeah.
And that's kind of similar to some things that we're discussing in our country here today, how we have dealt with or not dealt with our own history. So I thought that was interesting.
I just watched a philosophy professor talking about that exact thing, the way that Germans dealt with that guilt.
I probably just watched the same video.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was like, I don't want to bring it. I don't want to get too much into it because I have too many other things to talk about.
Yeah.
So they kind of leave off this chapter leading into club enactments, mentioning that that conflict between more culturally diverse emergence of subculture started to minimize the activist punk ontologies. So obviously a lot was changing during this period. Clubs a few years into the 80s started playing broader spectrums of music like post-punk and new wave. And they mention how being part of a subculture started incorporating dancing and listening to music with groups of friends. So that's what this section is talking about. Social club settings that started to diminish activist enactments. For darks specifically, activism became a personal choice rather than a requirement. They do talk about how punks and darks didn't necessarily disagree politically. It was just they disagreed how they should go about changing things. Darks were not centered around protesting and putting up political flyers or joining squats. Many darks did do those things, but it wasn't a requirement. So punks would provoke through their actions and aggression, while darks would provoke visually. Punks rejected the system entirely, while darks talked about trying to do what they could from within the system while escaping into fantasy worlds of their mind, basically.
Can I interject real quick? There's a quote here that directly addresses this that I really liked.
Okay.
From the book. It starts with the author's voice here saying that what Dark in the Music Club Enactment had in common with punks and the Creatori Simili was a similar interpretation of the present times seen as marked by an epoch-making defeat, which was political and cultural at the same time. Political because the repression of the radical movements of the 1970s had put an end to any hope of changing society. And then a quote from Joy Kicks, one of the interviewees, said both punks and darks had internalized repression. But while punks screamed outwardly, darks screamed inwardly. Darks were more self-destructive than openly aggressive. I don't know which one was better or worse. However, it represented a very strong criticism against the dominant models.
Yeah. Which, it's funny to me because they talk about this inward and outward, and then they also some people talk about what stuck out to me was feeling like collective action was dead, or a dead end, I guess. And then so their solace was through individual expression.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit ironic considering this is about the importance of community experience and coming together in these venues. And that's kind of why I feel like both the darks and the punks kind of missed the point, where one felt like you had to have this totalizing violent revolution, and that the arts were superfluous, and the other felt like common ground based action was pointless, because it didn't change anything other than destroying your life, which, to be fair, a lot of those people experienced. But I think that's also kind of the way that a lot of people in the scene today view political action, where they want to avoid it because they see it as this divisive force, this one or the other. Whereas in my view, and I talked about this kind of on the previous episode, but that I think that rhetoric is a tool of the owning class to keep the working class and the poor atomized, so that the owning class can retain power and create these hierarchies and divisions so that we aren't working in a common goal. So it's also a little strange as well, because the enactment framework the authors are using is this idea of co-creating the world in a collaborative reciprocal web, and I'll talk about that more when I talk about Ted Schotsky. But the interviewees' discussion of these sort of dichotomies, individual and collective action, internal and outternal, is kind of at odds with the framework that the authors used. But I can relate to that because it's also my eternal frustration with the way that goths talk about things a lot of the time too.
Yeah, so. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah. So in comparison to the punks, the identity politics of Milano darks are described as being a collective and shared retreat open to social relations using a sort of theatrical passive aggression as outward presentation to become the other and resist the political status quo. And I think I have a note to read from page 103. I hope this isn't the thing you just read.
It's not. Mine was page 100. I think I have your thing written down as well.
So it says, if Dark as enacted in music clubs withdrew from an open political opposition, simply taking its distance from mainstream values, it did so in an openly showy theatrical way, as a sort of passive-aggressive accusation. Darks voluntarily took on the role of the other, visually emphasizing their difference. The silent refusal to adopt the new values of hedonism and consumerism had to be publicly exhibited through the visual shock provoked by clothes, makeup, and hairstyles. This often implied a conflict at home, in the workspace, or at school. So for that enactment, outward presentation became the way to identify a poser, which it was different than the previous one. If you changed, they talk about, actually there's another, I'll have you read this next one, but somebody talks about if you looked different at your job or with your family or at school, you weren't a true dark. And if you didn't dress within the boundaries of the subculture all the time, you would get a different label as some other thing outside of the community.
All right. So a quote from the book, again, one of the interviewees, Sergio Dimeda. What would be the point? There are kids today that have like 50 piercings on their faces, and it's no big deal. They have absurd hair and tattoos everywhere. And this is a result of what we did in the 80s. If it wasn't for us and punks, they wouldn't be able to do that stuff today. But in the end, the system accepted them. They became mass byproducts and lost their original significance. Dismantle ordinary people's stereotypes, restructure the concept of family and the work environment by restructuring yourself, starting from not caring what other people think about you. And above all, have your own ideals, or better yet, create them, because we couldn't find them in any political movement. I used the word movement a couple of times, but more than a movement, we were simply a group of people.
And for me, I think that illustrates, again, something I brought up in the previous episode, but the co-optive power of capitalism. When the resistance is of an individual nature through identity politics, capitalism can then incorporate that resistance into the system through markets and sell it back to you through corporations or through the marketplace of ideas. And that then undercuts transformative change, which that's not to say that outward deviance is a bad thing, but that's not something that's going to address the root of economic disparity or bigotry, because those symbols of deviance then are just integrated into the system. And then going back to the way those markets can divide the working class, I have heard older goths lament, just like this, how kids today can get away with dressing weird and they don't appreciate what we did, which, again, you're creating competition among people in the same class. And
it's a problem. And what the older generation who did all that work should be feeling is pride in a job well done, in that what their goal was normalizing this sort of, well, that's an assumption. Assuming their goal was attempting to normalize this personal expression and not using it as a tool to simply shock people. So assuming the goal was normalizing personal expression, they succeeded. Now, I can understand the frustration if their goal was to shock people for some other, as it mentioned in the book and you mentioned before, for a passive resistant or passive aggressive kind of way of doing resistance by being shocking and outwardly expressing. If that becomes normalized, it loses its teeth. And if that happens without the underlying change that was the real goal being enacted, then you're right. There is a failure there. But I think that failure was more a strategic failure in that you weren't so clear on what the change you wanted was. So they just made the change that looked like it would normalize your behavior and make it not so shocking, but didn't change the underlying thing you were really protesting because you were being a little too subtle about it.
Right. And it's something that can be, it's not like a union or a co-op or something where you can't really co-opt that. It's something that can be repackaged in a market. But anyway, I want to move on from that.
One quick thing. I'd say it's like normalizing the LGBT community and homosexuality as a part of society versus normalizing wearing rainbow colors.
Right. Yeah. There's a difference between a way of being and like rainbow capitalism.
Right.
One of the other important bits there in this, I think, is the way subcultural capital is earned for club enactments, which is basically just respect that you earn in the scene through doing something that the scene values. And I guess we kind of mentioned this, but for Darks in the club enactment, it's brought about through clothing, participating in music and group settings, and expertise of the subcultural canon, which we'll talk about. And then before we get to loner enactments, there was one bit in here that was, I think, maybe the most surprising thing for me in hearing these stories. Trey, I don't know if you're down for reading something else.
Absolutely.
Here.
I'm always down for reading things.
Okay. It's kind of a big chunk.
That's fine.
So there's one paragraph on page 113 and one paragraph on page 114, but they're different paragraphs just to kind of get the gist of this story without like reading the entire thing.
All right. So this is another quote from Sergio Di Meda. You could actually draw a map on how Milan was divided in the mid-'80s. We hung out at the Moretto. At one end of Via Torino, there was a hangout at the Standa and another in front of Wendy's, a fast food joint. Punks were at the Standa, and there were some scattered darks, rockabillys, a couple of skinheads in front of Wendy's, a mix of people. At first, punks had it in for us, and they took the piss out of us. They'd call us fags, ravenettes, stuff like that. Nothing serious ever happened, but rather than being hassled by the punks, you'd walk on the skinhead side. Things were completely different 2 years later. The skinheads kicked you, called you commies, so you couldn't pass by them anymore. The skate punks, the first breakdancers, hung out at the old Muretto in Coro Vittorio, Emanuele, and so did the Paninari a little farther on. The metalheads had their place in a narrow alley behind Palazzo Reale at the Transex store. In Via Torino, where the bookstores, before the pharmacy is now, there were the rockabillys, and just before the Cologne, on the right, was the wine shop. Now, there was the Oktoberfest pub where the really bad skinheads hung out. The ones who did some serious beating up, so you had to go all the way around to get to the stores. You couldn't pass by there. Today, when I hear Dark saying they're right wing, it makes me laugh and angry. We were always hated by the right-wingers. All right-wing movements considered us the enemy. We even had trouble with rockabillys sometimes, but that was mainly just taking the piss. On the other hand, we had no problems with the bikers. Some of them liked krautrock, German electronic music, so they'd come to the Hysterica sometimes and kept mostly to themselves. You didn't break their balls, otherwise it meant trouble, but they didn't come to make trouble. The same was true of the metalheads. You'd go to the Transex to buy a couple of studs for your jacket. They didn't actually see you in the best eye, but we had never had any problems with metalheads.
So yeah, I thought that was just a nice little bit of flavor for the interactions between subcultures. And I was also just hearing about the ways the city was divided up into like gang turfs basically was surprising for me.
Yeah, they mentioned... there was a quote later that it was like living in the movie The Animals.
Yeah.
I thought that was one thing that I found very interesting too. Initially, I noticed it in the club scene. It wasn't just in the local or the public enactment, which is what this is coming from, but in the club enactment as well. It started with very similar discussions about how I've always heard about club life in the 80s, where it's not like today where you had a goth night or a techno night or an 80s night where they were very siloed and very much one genre and nothing else. It was much more egalitarian, and they played some new wave, and they played some post-punk, and they played some industrial and goth, and it was this big melting pot, and it was always sort of portrayed as this sort of hippy-dippy kumbaya, everybody getting together and listening to each other's music, and this interchange of ideas. That was always the portrayal I was hearing when talking about clubs in the UK or in the US in the 80s, where in this, it was very much closer to kind of what I experienced in, I guess, the 90s, was the mixing pot of musical styles, but the crowd wasn't so kumbaya about the whole thing. You'd have, if they're playing rockabilly stuff, you'd have the rockabillys out dancing, and the goths and the skins and punks would be glaring at the dance floor with their arms crossed, being unhappy about it and picking fights with each other. And then the music would change and a different group would go out there. It was very much again, like the city description, very factionalized and very, separate, even though they were being forced because of the nature of being in an alternative scene and being an underrepresented group with very limited gathering spaces, especially ones that could not, public spaces like clubs had to be able to monetize. And if there weren't enough darks or enough skinheads or enough rockabillys to have a single night, there were enough goth, skinheads, rockabillys, and punks to have a melting pot night, but that led to this hostility and often to outright violence, whether it was just, like they were saying, they're just busting your balls, up to and including stabbings. Again, it usually fell short of actual deaths, with a couple of rare instances that they mentioned. But for the most part, they made a very strong point of saying that rarely did it ever get much past hospitalization and some stitches, but there was definitely more than just a bloody nose kind of thing. So I found that very interesting, how that it's a much less rosy view than what I've seen described in the past. And I suspect it wasn't unique to Italy and the Milan or that scene. I suspect that probably happened in the US and the UK as well. And I got some hints of that in Kosi's book that I read a few years ago, in that she was also talking about at least conflicts in the public space, not so much in the club space, but in the public space with skins or bikers or punks or mods or whatever the various factions at the time were that were sharing those same squats or the same spaces.
Mm-hmm. So as we have those tensions going on, as we move into the next enactment to be talked about, the transition here is sort of that the club scene became more and more popular, and then we started to see new people coming into the scene, and they were taking everything much less seriously, seeing dark as an identity, and less related to music or clothing, but something that you felt inside, something that had an aspect of self-deprecating humor, and some of them in the club culture incorporating fetish and hedonism. For the loner enactments, though, they were facilitated by cultural consumption and production within the subcultural canon. The authors talk about the difference between those who developed their identity through cultural participation and those who developed it privately through literature and music, and that they would come together in clubs as sort of a rite of passage to become part of something bigger, which I resonated with as something I personally have experienced. They mention, though, for loners, the desire to construct a personal world through ephemera like records, books, and clothes, which would be bought from people within the scene. So kind of that self-sustaining system of flow of capital that Hodgkinson was talking about.
I say the big thing to mention here, since you brought up Hodgkinson, is the commitment angle, which seemed to be probably the strongest thing that the loner goth really gravitated towards.
Yes, I'm going to get into that as well, I think. Yeah, they link some of this also to McRobbie's Cultures of the Bedroom, which as a way to sort of understand identity formation for young people. I didn't really like that. I think that's like an outmoded way of understanding youth subcultures, but they talk about the way that I don't want to talk about McRobbie necessarily, but I think the technology we have available now, the way that facilitates communication and dissemination of information and action even, causes us to think differently about ourselves and value things differently, and also develop our identities. And actually, I think maybe that's where some of the tensions come in between different generations of goths, whereas maybe like Gen X or boomer goths see this line of continuation from the 80s until now as a through coherence. And so then they kind of express anger at changing norms in the scene from people coming into it. I think an example I came across that I thought was relevant to this last week was a advertisement for Gatain Damone. I don't know who else was playing, but doing playing shows for Christian Death, and they sing Romeo's Distress in the trailer with Gatain Damone, a white woman, saying the N-word.
Yep.
And I'm like, really? In the year of our Lord 2021, this is happening? I don't think many of the Gen Z goths would find that acceptable. And there was another example there's an Obscura Undead video talking about generations of goths. And at one point, the Gen Z goths expressed how they would find it unacceptable to be using World War II era uniforms as goth aesthetic. And the Gen X goth said basically, like, I see what you're saying, but we had a very different perspective on that in the 90s. And then, yeah, going back to even what you were saying about the sort of the abuse or the things people had to go through to have more of an extreme look, the harassment that came with that, getting kicked and spit on. I think you have this kind of, people hold on to that as a like litmus test for authenticity, as going through that adversity.
It's a form of subcultural capital.
But which is, it just sounds to me like, hey, I was traumatized and it made me care deeply about my place in the community. And if you don't experience the same trauma, that means you're less dedicated. which is like pretty fucked up.
It's a problematic view. I mean, I can defend the view in that it is understandable, and it is a form of subcultural capital in that it does show a commitment. You weren't just, like we mentioned, a weekender or someone who would dress for special occasions like a Halloween costume, but then in every day would conform so they don't have to pay the price of their divergence. And I can understand that from the commitment angle of enactment.
Yeah.
But by the same token, you should be proud of the fact that if they do the same thing that you got beaten up for, then, good on you for taking that bullet. And it's great to be proud of that sort of thing. But you normalized it, so don't give people shit for being themselves, and just because they don't have to suffer as much as you did to be yourself.
Yeah.
Because you can't keep pushing the envelope, right? That's always the problem with this sort of shock tactic and with this sort of passive aggressive thing, is you can only push the envelope so far before you've gone to the most extreme end, at which point it kind of wraps over, and we're kind of seeing that with going to extreme right-wing sort of things, and some of this punching down politics that we're all talking about now to be edgy, right? Being edgy is no longer being sexually explicit and, having blood all over your face and wearing black and spiky hair and these weird colors and studs. That's not edgy anymore. So now edgy has to be jokes about rape and about slavery and stuff like that. And that's, it is offensive to the cultural norm, but the problem is, if the cultural norm moved to an area where you want it to be, is it important to continue trying to kick against said cultural norm?
Yeah. You brought up, I think it was Sarah who talks about the Sunday darks and this sort of
a couple of times. Yeah, I think so.
People being embarrassed to, or her perception that people were embarrassed to dress goth in other situations. And for me, I thought that kind of played into this like privilege in a sense, because you're making judgments about these people that you don't know their life situation, and you don't know, like, maybe they are in danger if they dress that way in other situations.
Right. It correlates with some of what it was saying earlier in the chapter, with some of the stories of the people when they're talking about the activist enactment, when Sarah and some of the other people that were interviewees in the private enactment were talking about the things that they suffered from. It was getting a couple points knocked off on their grades because they showed up to a final exam in spikes, and the person was affronted by that. Getting shunned by polite society at the home, or being judged by their parents, but their parents aren't stopping them. Their parents aren't beating them. They're just being disappointed in them and, being made fun about in public. Whereas in the activists, they're talking about, when you are out there being an activist, when you're protesting, when you're being a punk in these squats, you are jailed. You are beaten by police. You're beaten by fractional gangs. You're hospitalized. The stakes are very different here. So, someone who really wants to put themselves out there and court physical violence, incarceration, the destruction of their life because of having a criminal record is very different from someone who's getting ridiculed at school or getting slightly lower grades, but not flunking out, not being expelled, just getting maybe a B. There's a lot more. We live our truth, and I am always this, and I'm not going to make any compromises. But if the situations were the same, would you make the same decisions? And that's not something that, the people who didn't have that experience can speak of. So they can judge all they want. But like you were saying, you don't know the people who you're judging and what their repercussions are and what their lived experience is.
Yeah. Also, I guess kind of on a different note, I wanted to just maybe I'm off base here, but I have concerns about loner enactments even today as being separated from social environments. And, when I did my homology hypothesis, that was, for me, that's one of the important parts of being goth, is being part of a community. And because I think when you lack that social aspect, you can, I hate to keep going back to like neoliberal identity politics, but it's sort of, you risk kind of your identity becoming a consumer identity. And I kind of want to explain that a little bit, but I think it breeds like really a toxic sense of ownership of culture. And the way I think I see this happening today, I get occasional comments, people coming on YouTube calling me an SJW and that kind of thing. And
usually like the same two people, but yes.
Yeah, true. I feel like what happens is when your identity is turned into a commodity, like the things that you buy and consume, and your identity isn't driven by community discourse and participation, you feel a ownership over that community because that is conflated. Goth then becomes your personal identity. And so when you hear me or somebody else talking about goth in a way that you disagree with, you go into this sort of identity protection.
Yeah, it's a fight or flight response. You're being actively physiological, in it feels to the brain like you're being physically attacked, and you need to defend yourself. You are being threatened in a very real sense as far as your brain is concerned.
Yeah. And and I've seen people pop up in online forums that no one knows who they are, and they go on these huge diatribes about how this is how goth should be defined and understood, and everyone who thinks differently is an idiot. And I think that social isolation breeds that kind of thing, and that kind of consumer identity. And so yeah, I just want to, I think there's, because I see it happening.
There's an added wrinkle that is I think aggravating that now, that wasn't a factor back then too. And that's the very fact that now you can kind of be a loner and in a community of loners. It's the internet effect, the fact that you can silo yourself with all these people who are just like you, so you can feel you're being part of a community. You're not this loner, so you can't use that as a mitigating factor. This thought of, well, maybe I'm not seeing other people's perspectives because I'm only living in my own head. I'm just listening to this music in my dark bedroom and reading the books that the lyrics are referencing and developing all this in isolation. So maybe I can take myself away from that and go, hey, I can look at those other people. What happens now is you have that enactment, you get online and you find a community of the millions and millions of communities online that has that same experience to the letter, because you can find that sort of distinction online because there are so many people and it's easy, and the algorithms are actually leading you in that direction too. They're actively trying to get you to find the place that you find community with, because that's where you're going to stay and you're not going to leave, and you're going to watch the ads and you're going to engage with that and make money to the host of that community. So
Jordan Peterson.
Amongst
let me
others,
sell you the feeling of alienation.
But I mean, that is endemic to the internet culture. That's the one major downside that all the optimistic futurists at the birth of the internet didn't foresee, which we couldn't. That's a lot of stuff that was emergent with the internet. We were viewing this giant melting pot. Everybody could get everyone else's experiences without realizing that, just like in the real world, we'll figure out how to tribalize ourselves, how to find our people, and with a larger pool to pull from, our people can become actually even more restrictive, because when you're alone and sort of desperate for that connection, you'll make compromises. You go, well, they're not exactly like me, but they're close enough, and I need that outlet. I need that community. I need that club space. I need that squad. I need that society. I need that tribe, whatever it happens to be. We are social animals. We do need that community to some degree. And so we would make compromises if we are going to sort of a desperation and we can't find that because we've limited our pool too much. But when the pool opens up, we can become that much more picky, still have that need met by developing a community, but that community is a giant echo chamber because everybody in there is just like you. And then your worldview gets skewed because you start spending more and more time in that comfortable environment, and you start to perceive that environment as the worldwide norm. And not quite the worldwide norm, I guess, because if you're in I guess, goth spaces, it is part of that identity as being an outsider. So you don't view it as a worldwide norm, but you view it as a norm of goth, because that's your insider-outsider experience. And so your perspective is that, well, the majority, as I understand it, is thus, and this person outside of my inside group doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about because they're disagreeing with me. And I can't, and it's harder for you to interject saying, hey, there's a broader perspective here, because they think they see this giant perspective because they have other people, they have a community that agrees with them.
Yeah. Oh, and I think what I wanted to say about Sarah is that I was trying to find the story. She brings up how she felt that the city darks were pretending to be culturally elite because they had immaculate looks, which to her meant they were probably not dressing like that in their everyday lives. And that's one of those assumptions that's kind of rooted in, I have to divide everything between us and them.
Yeah, she read too much Catcher in the
Rye. So that kind of came about where I guess she felt that way because those other darks would ignore her when she walked down the street. And the problem with that is obviously there are plenty of potential reasons that maybe they didn't talk to you. Obviously, you didn't go talk to them. Yep. I know in my life, I've had plenty of experiences like that of being completely ignored by other goths who I didn't know. But in those situations, I also didn't go over and talk to them either. So it's probably usually been because of my lack of social skills or my anxiety, or sometimes if they do look like the immaculate goth, I feel intimidated or I feel some form of insecurity about myself. But it's easy to project why that might be onto them. But when I have stepped out of my anxiety and spoken to a goth that I felt like looked too perfect to be bothered with me, they ended up being perfectly pleasant. So
yeah, I mean, what I've found from my personal experience as someone who also is very reticent to go up to people when I'm in a new situation in space is that if you choose that lifestyle, if you choose to try to be a member of a community and you go to the shared spaces and you just be in the spaces without approaching people, it takes about a year of doing so regularly to be acknowledged. And that's assuming that there are people in that space who are outgoing and inclined to acknowledge outsiders and aren't also painfully shy and difficult. But if you become sort of a known quantity after, and that seems to take, in my experience, about a year for like monthly events, maybe a little bit less if it's a weekly event. So maybe it takes 52 instances of being in their presence. I don't know. But that's been sort of my rough rubric as I've been, as I've moved around a bit and had to reintroduce myself to, say, I've had 3 different scenes that I have become sort of a known fixture in. And each one of them, it took me approximately a year of regular attendance of the major public event that scene tends to gravitate around, for me to be sort of acknowledged by other insiders. And then once I'm acknowledged, I'm much more comfortable just interacting, because then I'm an insider and it's no longer coming up to strangers. They approached you. So if you want to live life that way, you can. It's viable. I've obviously done so. But it takes patience. And if you don't have patience, you're going to run into a situation kind of like Sarah's describing here. And I don't know what her actual timetable was. Maybe she did try for a year before she gave up on these elitists. Who knows? But her story doesn't seem to indicate that. It didn't indicate, I've been going and going and going and going and going and going and going, and then nobody really paid attention to me. It seemed like a couple of instances, and she said, you know what? This sucks. It's not worth it to go out to these things. I make continue to go to an odd concert because that's the only way I can see this band I like. But these shared spaces, these shared events that aren't one-of-a-kind concerts, screw that. I'm just going to stay at home listening to my records and reading Sartre.
I think, I actually heard, you're talking about Jean-Paul?
Yes.
I heard that pronounced as Sartre. And I don't know if that's correct, but that's what I was going to go with.
I've never heard it pronounced as Sartre.
It sounded different. It was someone with a British accent, so I thought, oh, he must know what he's talking about. Sartre
is French. And the British definitely take the piss out of the French. So at best, that might have been an insult to a French philosopher or a French thinker.
Well, I mean, he was talking about him in a loving way, but
that's fair. Who knows? So, I haven't asked the person himself. They're long dead.
That's
I've
true.
visited their grave, but
oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I was in Paris once, and went to I believe it was Cimetière de Montparnasse. I went there mostly because that's where Baudelaire's grave is. But Jean-Paul Sartre was also there, as is Serge Gainsbourg. And a couple. It's not the famous one where Jim Morrison is buried. That's the other famous Parisian cemetery. But it was a beautiful cemetery, and I mostly went there because I'm a Baudelaire fan.
Yeah. Well, he comes up in this book.
He does.
Well, all right. So since you brought up Jean-Paul, but because I have it in my notes, I did want to start talking about some theory here. I'm going to try and compress some of this, but I do want to talk about Schottky in a bit more depth. But they do in this section bring up Peterson and Bennett's scene theory, which revolves around these three classifications of the local, translocal, and virtual. And they use that to kind of delineate the epistolatory nature of loner enactments against the local nature of the darks in that place. But I don't like they only bring it up briefly, and it's that places scene against the mainstream, so it's necessarily I guess representationalist and foundationalist. So I don't like that. I don't think it fits. I think the material and discursive collapse onto each other, and we don't need these sort of kind of colonial ideas of us versus them. These epistemic dichotomizations. So I didn't like that. I don't think it fits with Schottky's flat ontology, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And also, it doesn't really make sense to me where, like, isn't the virtual also local and vice versa? How they talk about the translocal as being homogenous, but to label it in a cohesive way. But it doesn't, when they talk about these examples of like punks in Myanmar, it seems really contrived. So I had some notes on this. I don't really want to go into it though, because it's not super important, but I just want to bring it up that I don't like it. But let me talk about the important thing, which is the social ontology or site ontology, which Tassoni and Zakala lean on Schottky for to understand social practices of darks. So Tassoni and Zakala talk about the plurality of forms of subcultural identity that are still consistently distinctive, and they do that through the notion of practice being embedded and embodied, specifically in the way that Schottky defines it and his framework. They have a couple paragraphs about this in the second chapter, I believe, and I read it, and there was no real context to what they were talking about, and it didn't make sense. So I spent a bunch of time reading Schottky to try and understand this. And I don't necessarily want to explain his framework in and of itself, but sort of in relation to these enactments. the way that he sees social phenomena is as interrelated bundles of activity. So there is no macro or micro. There's just an increasing distance of connection, or the connections are less dense as you zoom out, so to speak. So the supposed macro structures, which you could say goth as a whole, kind of generically as a macro structure for this purpose. And then scene would be a microstructure, though obviously, like, the whole point is Shotsky is saying they aren't macro or micro. We shouldn't think about them in that way. These supposed macro structures are supervened by, or basically composed of, or constituted by, bundles of linked practices and material arrangements, and that's what constitutes society. And so that plays into the notion of consistent distinctiveness, I think, in the ways that goth is recognizably practiced across borders, which those practices produce diverse relations around the same bundles, which Shotsky would categorize as, like, he has these, they mention them in the book. He actually expands on the 4 they mention, but he categorizes the components of that as the components of these relations and material arrangements as internal relationships, dissemination of innovations, shared goals, chains of actions, and rules, which he calls teleoaffective structures. So when Shotsky talks about materiality, enactments, or the ways that we bring things forth into the world, in this case goth, he says, are entwined with material practices. So if we're at a picnic in a cemetery, we have a teleoaffective structure. That just means an intention or an end. So in that instance, it would be probably to socialize and to relax and spend time with each other. So that's brought forth through the interactions with people and things, the ways that we engage with the food, or the fancy finery that we brought with, or the gravestones, or the people around us. Or for a different example, if Faith and the Muse are playing a concert, you have a stage and lights and a dance floor and instruments. These are all part of a spatial arrangement, and we interact with and manipulate these arrangements so they become contingent to the meaning of the practice. Or Shotsky would say the doing and the saying as a kind of shorthand.
Is that kind of linked to what I was saying earlier about the way darks and punks enacted musical practice?
Yeah. Basically, yeah.
Okay.
I really like, I hadn't heard of him before. I really like his site Ontology, and the ways that he talks about bringing forth ontology in complex and extended ways, because it's an anti-essentialist way of viewing what it means to embody a culture. I do have, like, some minor disagreements. I think his site Ontology is still anthropocentric. I'd actually be within social practice theory, I would be what they call a post-humanist, which they basically claim that non-humans do non-humans, because we're not talking about humans. Anthropocentric means you're focusing on human activity as the primary mover or locus of meaning. So non-humans do not just mediate, but themselves propagate practices, would be the post-human perspective. So practices would comprise the interaction of human and non-human activities. And I think that's a bit more of an extreme position than what Shotsky takes, but he's not too far off from that. He also says in one of his books, I can't remember now because I didn't write it down, because I was, like, browsing through PDFs. He says that the body signifies cognition, whereas I would say the body actively shapes cognition. And then the last thing is he talks about people and objects being causally linked, where people act on objects, these material arrangements. And I think, and I talked about this in the other book review we did. I think there's more of a relational interaction where if you're constituting the atmosphere of a club, it's constituted by the fog acting on bodies as much as it is bodies acting on the fog. So I think he would say the material arrangements or how they are configured would not exist without practice. And I would say the materials themselves are constituted in part by the practice rather than pre-existing. But anyway, that's my interpretation. Again, I could be completely off on that. But the short version of all that, though, is basically for goth to exist, we need to bring it into existence through material arrangements and practices. So like fashion, conversation, creating art, and these things co-disseminate and give rise to goth. Now, as I was thinking about this, it reminded me, sort of thinking about the idea of co-constitution of social environments through human and non-human entities. I wanted to read this, a quote from a friend of mine, Paulo, something he sent to me a few years ago, because I think it illustrates why we tend to find these categories that we're talking about. So like the three enactments, or the local, the translocal, and the virtual, or the three parts of the dark canon that we're going to get to. Why we tend to find these categories so important. I think this nicely illustrates that. So I just want to read this. I could summarize it, but I think it's better if I just read this quickly. So he says, he's talking about the concept of a looping effect. He says, this is essentially a sociological one introduced by Ian Hacking. Essentially, the notion refers to how, in very important ways, categories once introduced into a particular practice will loop back to causally influence people and how they then categorize and understand themselves through the said category. This will in turn reinforce and change the category itself. Hacking introduced this concept in the context of mental disorders, and I personally think he's very much on the money here. There are two crucial points to understanding the notion of looping effects. First is that human and social categories, so mentally ill, refugee, or goth, are all moving targets. That is, they are not statistically fixed, but continuously changing. Concepts evolve, new concepts and ideas which help describe experience emerge, and others fall by the wayside. Secondly, and most importantly, is that these concepts and categories have real causal effects on people. Once in circulation, these concepts and categories loop back onto people such that they now not only recognize, but also reconceive themselves through these concepts, labels, and categories. This in turn enables new kinds of people vis-a-vis the concepts and categories. So changing ideas and concepts change people, and in turn, changed people often require further change in ideas and concepts. Yeah, and then he says, Goth offers a really great example of this, in my opinion. Once the category is introduced, it allows people to identify with it such that they, at least as Goth was first emerging, also co-constitute what Goth itself is. But because Goth is not static, either as a category or worldly phenomena, what it is to be a Goth both changes the people who identify as Goth, and in turn, this changes the category of Goth itself. This is one of the reasons there is currently a number of different types of goth, quote unquote, subcategories that emerge. New goths take up and identify with these categories, and in so doing, bring into existence new kinds of people. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about that later. But just the last sentence he says is these new kinds of people, their experiences, ideas, new concepts, what they might introduce, will in turn loop back into the category and alter it, and so forth, so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that's a useful addition to thinking about these enactments that Tassoni and Zakala develop in this book, and I think they might even agree with that explanation. The how forms of being arise co-constitutively. Oh, I did kind of want to bring up authenticity because they talk about this in the book. what is and isn't authentic, or how different enactments understand what is an authentic identity. And I think this is important because that word gets thrown around a lot. And it generally, I think, tends to ascribe some essential quality to the category, rather than something that's created through practice of the people in the community. I think authenticity, when you're talking about that, it kind of is meaningless in a way, because it really depends on what you mean by authenticity. And I think people kind of talk past each other on that. There's a few different ways to understand it. You could say it's the ability of people to do whatever you want, regardless of those around you. You could say it's the ability to decide between multiple options that are available to you. It could be the degree to which you perform identity in a way that aligns with pre-existing rules or structures of meaning. I think if you are pursuing your goals and interests, if we understand authenticity that way, I don't think those goals or interests are somehow immutable characteristics of your core being. And I also think, importantly, that they interact with and affect the goals and interests of other people. I think often when someone says they're being authentic, it kind of assumes that you're free to choose whatever is the most true for some inner rational core, like to thine own self be true. Sartre, for example, I looked up a bit about how he viewed authenticity, because they bring him up in the book, and he sees it as authenticity as spontaneity, lucidity, activity, reflectiveness, self-sufficiency, and originality. So he says our consciousness spontaneously darts about viewing the world, emphasizing certain parts and ignoring others, that the person makes themselves each day. And he also says that honest reflection is a key to authenticity. But not everyone is going to mean that when they say authenticity is part of the problem. And for Goths, I think generally, I think the way I hear people use it is authenticity is described as the rejection of externally imposed norms in favor of appealing to an irreducible true self, to follow your heart. Kind of back to what Sarah was saying, dressing Goth no matter what the setting is. And I just want to distinguish that, like, I don't know how the authors feel about this. They don't really define authenticity. They just use the term. But I don't think that there is an essentialist core in any person. I think we seek a development of the self through practices and community and the world that we're embedded in, the material arrangements around us. Going back to what Shasti was saying.
One thing that I found interesting in the book on local enactment, the section of the book on local enactment, that kind of goes into, well, it's a very brief section. It's about the importance of shops, of like clothing shops, because it mentioned all the different locations that were important, whether they're cafes or bars or shops or hair salons, stuff like that. But the one in shops I found kind of interesting from an authenticity point of view, because a lot of the time when we think about authenticity in goth spaces, we are, like you were saying, talking about exposing your true self, what you truly are on the inside, putting it on the outside, all that sort of descriptions of why we dress the way we dress, and the idea of being a unique expression of individuality. But in the shop section, it was talking about what the importance to, at least, like I said, it was very short. There weren't a lot of quotes, so it could be just specific to these one or two people. But one thing they found important about going to the shops was seeing what was in style. And to me, from an authenticity point of view, if authenticity is defined as being true to your personal identity and exposing your true self, style shouldn't factor into it. And I found that interesting, especially when they had one quote from a person who said, I went shopping down there with my super trendy gay friends from Bologna who were always on top of the new styles.
Mm-hmm.
The question is from a Gothic style perspective, especially an individualist Gothic style perspective, why going with trendy friends who it didn't mention were in the goth, just they were trendy. And of course it also hits that gay stereotype. Why should that matter from an authenticity standpoint? And I found that was one of the things I found in that section to be kind of jarring based on my preconception of how authenticity is enacted within Gothic spaces.
And I think that makes sense because because I don't think there is this true self. So it is this, you're talking about doing things with your friends. You're embedded in the world around you. You are connected to and extended into a sort of who you are through other people and the things around you. And so of course that is important to your sense of self. And this idea of a true self is, I think, problematic because it's egocentric. It's self-absorbed. It ignores that exact thing, the interrelatedness with organisms around us. And I think it's also interesting you say that because a little bit once we talk about what the dark canon is, I don't know if you've seen Dr. Mohler's videos on second order observation and Profilicity.
No.
But so I think he makes and I'm briefly going to summarize that, a really interesting comment about how we see ourselves differently now because of the technology we have. And it kind of relates to the thing you just said. But we are in the home stretch now because we're going to just do dark canon, and then
it's also quickly related to the standard goth club joke of I'm a unique individual and you're just like everybody else.
We just all wear the same boots. Yeah. Which actually, I don't know if I don't know if I had this in my notes somewhere, but I do remember there was, is it in dark canon? Yeah, it is. Okay, so I think you're going to have some thoughts on this. It is in dark canon here. So let me kind of introduce what the dark canon is. So the short quote is plural authenticities and plural structures of meaning within the same subculture. The longer explanation of what that is. So canon obviously is a collection of music and history and art that give meaning to subculture. The way these function in the book, in the explanation in the book, is through semiotic solidarity. So works are judged on their own and in relation to the rest of the canon as a collection of materials that create a sort of narrative of style and taste and value. And importantly, these are things that can be negotiated and endlessly discussed, that are not static, but change over time. So it's a bottom-up negotiation that's dynamic and ongoing and controversial, which the controversial part is interesting. They do mention there are two views of canon. The first one is a stable fixed version. The one they go with is an open processual canon, which I also think is the correct way to go with that, but can again lead into that conflict we were talking about with, I think maybe a little bit with goths of a different era, kind of condemning additions or subtractions from the canon, because they do see it as a fixed, stable thing, when in reality it's not. So the three elements of canon in the book are music, and then literature, cinema, and art, and then the third one is clothing.
Interesting how they group those three. Or three. Literature, cinema, and art.
I think they kind of carry along with trying to parallel with the three enactments as well.
I think they are trying to force a parallel, but I think it's also indicative of the actual importance that they're putting on these items. And I think that's actually reflected pretty readily within Goth enactment, as evidenced by the fact that, what's the major debate within Goth? Music or fashion? So having those as two major enactments, and the other ones, they're more nebulous. People agree that literature and cinema and art have effects, but there's less of a consensus that having knowledge and experience or expertise in those things really matter at all, because I mean, no one really gives someone who's a romantic Gothic literature major a lot of subcultural capital. Within our spaces.
Not as much anymore. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think they ever really did.
Okay. All right.
Other than to relate them to the music. Like, oh, but this relates, the Cure lyric references this writer or this artist. But the art and literature itself, without the reference to the music, never, I mean, this has just been my experience, gives short shrift, or has been given short shrift within the community.
Yeah, mine was, I think, people who watch Adrian, Ligeia Resurrected on YouTube, her focus on Gothic literature as the primary, the most important aspect of, I don't know if she would say it's the most important, I don't think she would, but as her main interaction with Goth culture was sort of the way I heard people talk about Goth when I was younger.
Okay.
But yeah. So for music, though, they start by referencing Van Elfren, which I guess is not surprising since she's written extensively on Goth from a musicological perspective.
And has the main book on Goth musicology that we also reviewed.
Mm-hmm. But I think both of us kind of have some disagreements with her where I think her methodologies are good, because she's written about that in a couple different places, but she tends to come to wild conclusions, like including Rammstein and Manson and Nine Inch Nails as Goth music. They do mention in the book that the way she gets around having to formalize a method for selecting music is by taking the music from DJ playlists. How do you feel about that as a way to say, I'm not going to say this is what Goth is, so I'm going to take DJ playlists, and whatever the DJs are playing, that's what I'm going to include as my analysis of Goth music?
I mean, I'd say it's very problematic simply because a DJ playlist, well, let me preface this with, I'm assuming by DJ playlist she's talking about club DJs, because there's going to be a difference if we're talking DJs in general, like a Mixcloud or an online radio aimed at the Goth subculture. Because if you're talking club play, that's got an artificial filter of danceability, which is, of course, a moving target in and of itself. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, when played in clubs, while they're called, well, at least they used to be, they're now just called dark wave or something else more generic, but they used to be called Goth industrial clubs, mostly industrial clubs, because industrial had the danceability that Goth didn't necessarily have as directly. So your pool is going to be self-filtered based on this populism around danceability and or mixability, depending on if that's a factor that the DJ emphasizes. And again, mixability is going to also emphasize things with a steady beat, rather than something that's a little bit more flowy and off the grid, which especially older Goth tends to be, because modern music and especially electronic music, it's either electronic rhythm, which is right on the grid by design, or is recorded to a click track, which makes things a little bit more rigid, or has been post-processed within an inch of its life to become perfected, in whatever sense of the term that is, for modern sensibilities. Whereas original music, especially coming out of the punk ideology, was the whole DIY thing, but people going into a studio, turning on the tape recorder and jamming and saying, all right, that's a wrap, with all the imperfections and things. And that makes it less conducive for playing in a club night, because it's hard to get it to fix into a mix. So there are lots of problems, again, assuming she's referring to club DJs, that is an artificial filter on what constitutes the Gothic canon.
I mean, it also depends on like what the night is. If there are more general alternative nights that play, like Nocturna plays a broader range of music, or even people like DJ ATAC.
Yeah, or La Petite Morgue, which exclusively plays stuff after 2000. Doesn't play anything older.
DJ A-Tech, I know, likes to play joke songs.
Oh, I did too when I was a DJ. I loved doing that.
Which, like, yeah, I mean, you if you don't have a way of filtering those things. So, but anyway, I didn't think that was a good way to do that.
Yeah, it's hard as an outsider because there is an inside language happening there as well.
Yeah. So the first marker, though, of a band that would put them in the canon would be the sound, obviously. The interviewees often put the music they listen to into either a mainstream category or a DIY category. And so they use Duran Duran to illustrate this point by mentioning that initially Duran Duran was considered new wave, but eventually they were pushed out of the dark canon when they started becoming a really popular band with a huge audience. And I don't know if you have a thought about that.
I think Duran Duran's an odd one to choose. The interesting example I always have, though, they never really got pushed out, is The Cure, because of how much they changed in their life. I mean, you have, disintegration and pornography and faith as sort of their big goth phase. But then you've got all of their other stuff that, was either more straight ahead punk early on, went almost truly to pure pop later on. They never got booted out. They have sort of been grandfathered in as a pillar of goth. And I think a lot of people just sort of either don't play or just sort of give a pass to the stuff that doesn't fit from a sonic aesthetic standpoint. So I find them to be an interesting example, but there are a number of other examples of bands that were in there. I mean, you could also say to some degree with going Joy Division to New Order. Same band, barring one person. But I think completely different in appreciation. Yeah. Though early New Order was still okay, but then they transitioned out as well.
I think what they were trying to get at is the idea that subcultural music is complex and intellectual, while mainstream music is vapid and shallow.
I hate that so much.
I agree.
But it is really ridiculously common, and I watch so many videos debunking that. Not necessarily about the subculture, but about pop music in general, and the vapidity of pop music versus the authenticity of whatever the quote unquote real music that whoever the person talking about is engaged with. You have that also with the non-musical arguments around hip hop, rap, etc., because they're not melodic. They don't pay attention to harmony. They're rhythmic, and that's not as good as blah 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 blah.
Which, if you trace that back to where it came from, is because of racism.
There's a lot of essentialism. There's a lot of culturalism. There's a lot of racism in all of these things, and classism. That is bundled up into all of that sort of essentialist of what music is. This idea that any sort of music is objectively better or worse than any others because of arbitrary qualities that I've deemed to be the important ones.
Yep, exactly. Good. I don't even have to comment on that. You basically covered it. So then they bring up the social aspect of the music. So in the 80s, right, discovering music was a very social event. Even if you were just going to the record shop, the story I shared with you when
even
we were
the
at
loners,
Nocturna.
if you want to talk about in the book, the loners were talking about learning it through the zine scenes, through pen pals writing to people about, I like this and I like this. Oh, you like that? Let me check that out. So even the loners had that same communal basis for expanding musical vocabulary and expanding musical tastes.
The story I thought that was really cute that I brought up at Nocturna was the person who said that they had stopped asking the DJ what music they were playing because they were basically going up every single song and asking what the band was, and the DJ got sick of them. So what they would do is go to the record store and sing part of the chorus of a song, and the record store owner would be like, oh yeah, I know who that is, let me go find the album for you. But yeah, they, like you said, tape trading, bootlegs, shipping albums back and forth across the country. There's that intensely interpersonal music discovery process that happened as well, by just chatting with people and listening to music together. You know, like you would have a discussion with music with one group, and then later that group of people would go mingle with a different group, and so on and so forth. And so that's part of how what was and wasn't goth music was decided. And then to illustrate controversy, they have a few pages where they kind of explore the debate around Death in June, and people sharing arguments for and against whether a band that has such explicitly fascist imagery should be considered part of the canon, which was something that was happening at the time, and obviously has not gone away since then. So that was interesting. I could read some quotes, but I want to kind of get through this.
It was interesting how prominently they were even mentioned in this book, given the previous mentions of the very strong stance against the fascist imagery when it came to apparel, when it came to iconography. And maybe the music was less of an issue simply because this was stuff that they were discussing listening to music in private. They weren't discussing concerts and whether concerts were being banned, like Germany would do with like Leather Strip and some of those other bands that also used a lot of militaristic, fascistic imagery in their concerts and were refused entrance to play, or Tanz der Mussolini, which was banned in Germany.
Actually, they do bring up. I think that somebody mentions that concerts were important because I think he said this was because this was before Twitter, when you could go online and see your favorite musician talking about what they have for breakfast. The musicians of the scene were kind of like demigods in a sense, so seeing them in concert was a big deal. And I thought that was interesting.
Also writing to them in the epistolary section, they mentioned being able to write to artists you really like and getting responses back from like David Tibet or something like that.
Somebody mentions ending up writing in the subway with the drummer from Christian Death at one point, and was like, I think she was like, I was so surprised because I thought, wow, these guys must be really poor. Which was true.
Yeah.
So that kind of plays into what they call a sense of internal validation, meeting other groups of people to experience music they've been listening to. And then that carries over into the second part of Dark Canon, which is for them literature, film, and art. And I think thematically, this is very similar to what people in the past have called the goth mindset or lifestyle. Essentially the resistance of banality and pursuit of a rich tapestry of art and culture. So they have all the usual suspects in there. There's reference to songs from The Cure referencing different literary works, obviously, because that's a really dense well to pull from. References to Bauhaus, Dead Can Dance, Virgin Prunes, Nick Cave, The Hunger, Blade Runner, Nosferatu, and German Expressionism. Suspiria, obviously, that it would make sense that was a big deal. Dario Argento.
Yeah.
So in this case, the importance of art to understanding dark culture goes beyond aesthetic and ideological narratives and actually informs the norms within the scene. So as a result, you develop a scene that is dedicated to in-depth research into forms of expression and ways of understanding. And for me, that's very similar, going back to talking about hearing a lot about Gothic literature, that's very similar to the kind of goth culture I grew up in, and that was presented to me. So I have kind of a fondness for this aspect of it, I guess.
Sure.
But they for some people in the book, they talk about this being represented as an atmosphere to identify yourself with, kind of, again, going back to how I've heard people talk about the goth mindset. For some, they said it was an awakening of the masses of consumerist culture to break out of the system. Again, relating back to like their different types of enactments. The authors say these negotiations led to the definition of a core of widely shared cultural resources, creating a sort of shared language or semiosis where at the time you knew you could have a conversation with someone you ran into about Camus or Baudelaire, no matter where you were. And I did want to ask you, Trey, how accurate you think that is of goth today.
As far as
feeling like you have these shared subcultural resources and you can have a conversation, you can have a conversation with someone about maybe not Camus, but this specifically goth thing, no matter what scene you go to.
I don't know if I have a good answer to that. But I guess it really depends on the scene, because it's really varied for me from scene to scene.
Yeah.
Because like I said, I've been a pretty key member in 3 different scenes. One was Champaign-Urbana, which is a college town scene, in which case that was true. But I think that is more an aspect of being in a college town. So a lot of the people there were actively in philosophy classes or literature classes. They were actively learning this stuff at the time. So there's a given level of education because of that existing filter, as well as just the freshness of the knowledge. And of course, as you're learning it, you're passionate to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
Stuff that you've known about for a long time. If you're an old guard, elder goth, and you maybe got excited about Camus or Nietzsche or Sartre or Baudelaire back when you were first getting into goth, because you were introduced to it because of references in the various bands made references to it. And you learned about it and it was great and you got excited and you now know about it and it's just part of your history now. If someone really engages you in a way that says, oh, you have a lot to say about it, you might engage then. But if somebody is more new to it and is just being fresh and being excited about it, you might write them off as being, oh yeah, I went through that phase too. I don't want to deal with it again. The standard elder goth, I'm too old for this shit sort of thing that is the stereotype on that gatekeeping side of things.
Well, hey, Sartre wants us to dismantle capitalism. So
yeah, that's true.
That works for me.
So definitely in that scene, I saw it. In the Colorado Springs scene was a lot more working class and was mixed. And it actually had more talks about politics, especially libertarian politics. Colorado being a huge libertarian area and Colorado Springs being big on that. So we were having more talks about libertarianism and freedom, and some of that on a semi-superficial level sometimes, though. I mean, it was a real mixed bag, because there were people who were at all different experience levels, some of which who actually studied it, some of which who just heard about it and are into it because of other people. But that was a very different thing. And then Chicago, being the biggest scene I've been in, is a huge mix of people from all different backgrounds. You've got wealthy suburbanites, inner city kids. You've got people in poverty, people in wealth, and it's all across the board. So you do have people who are educated and want to talk about that sort of thing. You've got people who are not so formally educated, but have been self-educated and want to talk about similar things, but it's from a very different perspective when you're talking about someone who's been autodidact, like you were talking about earlier. It's a very different way in which they talk about maybe the similar topics, because they have a very different perspective on it, because they don't necessarily have the background of all of these other thinkers who are critiquing and counter-critiquing and analyzing and all of this back and forth, that if you took a formal education, you're steeped in all of that, which, neither one is, in my opinion, really better or worse than the other. They're both different interpretations of it. And most of the actual authors are dead. And frankly, they didn't agree with the people who were talking about it in their own time anyways. That's why they were debating it. So saying who is right and who's canon is kind of ridiculous. We do so anyways, but it is kind of ridiculous. And then people who just aren't interested in that. They have other concerns. They don't have the time or interest in that sort of thing. And they want to talk about other aspects. So especially in a larger scene like the major city scenes, you can't make that assumption. You have to know your audience because there are groups within groups within groups, and they all have different interests. So smaller scenes, you can get a feel for it and make that gamble. Larger scenes, you definitely can't unless you know all the subgroups and you know where to go if you want to talk about this versus that.
Yeah.
So here's a quote from the book from Joy Kicks. You couldn't have anything that wasn't black. Your attitude ranged from anguished and desperate to that of a melancholy soul, and your manner had to be very dandy, decadent, and extremely polished. It was a style that drew from a genre of literature, Oscar Wilde, Poe, and at the time I was deeply moved by Georges Karl Huysmans' Against Nature, and obviously by the great Baudelaire. We used a lot of symbols tied to necrophilia, death, crosses, and we even went to cemeteries, but not to desecrate the graves. They were expeditions that had nothing to do with satanic worship. They were just nighttime walks with music in the background. Then piercing and tattoos hit the scene. They were illegal then, and nobody was supposed to know that there was a guy that made tattoos because he would have risked God knows what. Piercing came from psychic TV and that scene. For the person getting a tattoo, there was a rituality to it, and it had a very important meaning. We used our entire body to express what we thought and how we felt. It was the only territory that had been left to us.
So there are a number of elements identified as being relevant to aesthetic expression. Heterogeneity and individual creativity, but creativity that also reflected common tastes was one element. They talk about, this is the thing I was trying to think of before, the tension between brand identity, such as Doc Martens becoming part of the stylistic identity.
Or Trip NYC.
Yep, or Killstar. Because some darks argued that the open consumerism as part of the scene was anathema to what it was about. So again, going back to conflicting ideas about what being dark meant.
The funny thing is, that's why I don't own or wear any band T-shirts as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I like liking bands, but I don't necessarily want to advertise.
Right. Interesting.
I'd rather have the dialogue than just be a walking billboard.
Right. Fair enough. What else? There's also the an identity construction element. The way that you physically present yourself to reflect, again, your inner reality, as the interviewees describe it, which generally was identified with refusing the prescriptions of society for how you should conduct yourself as a good person, along with breaking societal norms such as gender presentation. This is where the authors kind of referenced Dunja Brill's book about gender. The relevant part of that to the book is one of the main themes, or the main theme, the idea that male goths benefit from androgyny more than women, and that there's an uneven application around expectations of bisexuality, which she says became an expected norm for women, but a praised trait in men. So Brill says the real problem basically is that goth is presenting its gender and sexuality as an idealized gender ethic that's superior to mainstream ideals, when in reality it replicates a lot of the same patriarchal problems. And in this book, they agree generally that women in the scene were disadvantaged in ways that reproduced mainstream systemic issues. They were just less obvious. They also say, though, quote, "For women, the androgynous goth style was a way to deconstruct dominant gender stereotypes and prescriptions, and for men, a way to distance themselves from the macho stereotype of the Italian male at the time." And we've kind of talked about Brill's book here and there. I guess, in short, I think that it's fairly accurate enough of the 90s and 2000s, but like I've said, I think as general culture has shifted and the conversation about gender identity and queer identities has become part of mainstream discourse, I think goth spaces have been quick to also address some of those issues because of their relation to queer scenes and queer members, really.
To a degree, I'd say goth spaces are still kind of stumbling through it, just like mainstream spaces are. It's something, because, you know, like you just said, it's different, but similar problems still exist in who gets more kudos for breaking those gender barriers and where the expectation lies in individual members.
Right. Yeah. That's fair.
So
it's
we may be better, but we're not by any means right
but,
or winning it so much.
Sure. Yeah. And again, it's, difficult speaking in generalities, because as this book is talking about enactments, there are a multiplicity of ontologies and different, depending who you're speaking with and what groups you're with, and it's going to vary anyway.
Yeah, and this book, at least the Italian Goth book, is also a retrospective book. So
yeah,
it can allow us to reflect on the current age, but it does not speak to the current age itself.
Right. And then as far as sexualities, there's a little bit of discussion, but I think most of the discussions in the book about sexuality from the interviewees are all guy and girl. There's not really any talk about gay relationships or polyamorous relationships. The authors explain, though, that there were gay clubs and counterculture at the time.
Mm-hmm. They mentioned shared spaces too in the club enactment, but not so much about whether while they shared the spaces, whether they interacted so much and how how healthy that interaction was.
They say the difference is that the queer spaces, those identities were around being gay, where for darks who, like you said, shared some of those spaces, the sexuality aspect was secondary to other aspects of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then let's see, what's the last thing here? So they say that the dark culture was a genuine indifference to sexual orientation. And I think at the time that was probably just being ambivalent in general was controversial. Just like men wearing makeup was controversial.
Mm-hmm.
I think what the tension we see now, though, is that as we've had some, that ambivalence through the 90s became less and less controversial. And when you're saying, if the core is the cultural beliefs and your individual beliefs are irrelevant, then over the long term you have some harmful, bigoted beliefs starting to seep in with people coming into the scene. So
that's always the problem with ambivalent beliefs. If you don't have a firm belief, then anybody who does have a firm belief automatically trumps that.
Yeah. So that's why I think that conversation is so important now.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So here's my last little bit of theory I want to talk about, and then we can just finish with if we have any general thoughts on the books or anything else you wanted to mention.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. So we talked about, what did we talk about? Oh yeah. So when we're talking about the way that information is spread through clubs and zines and record shops to develop this dark canon, the authors were saying that informs the norms and ideologies and identities of darks. Today, though, as I alluded to, I think this process is different because of the technology we have, or the different technology, I guess, that we have. And so I think what happens is that leads us to view our identities and experience of culture differently as well. I think rather than something similar to a loner enactment or a social club enactment, there's an argument to be made for a profile curation mindset where venues and DJs and everyday goths build dynamic identities through ratings, rankings, and algorithms. So as a personal example, we both went to Nocturno recently, and I know part of what was feeding into my social anxiety being there is the pressure I put on myself to live up to my profile when I'm at a club. So I host a podcast where I intend it to be insightful and welcoming and intelligent. I have a personal profile where I present myself in a certain way. And so when I'm in public settings, I put pressure to embody those things in myself when I'm part of that community that I care about. So the way, what it becomes is this sort of second order observation where I'm thinking of myself not through my experience of myself. I'm thinking of myself through the eyes of someone else who is viewing me.
I think that's more common than you are, than you think it is, or
that's a personal example. I think everybody does that now.
Yeah, well, I don't even think that's now. I think that's been the human thing forever. Is everybody always acts as if everybody's eyes are on them at all times, and that's been the case for a long time.
I mean, yeah. Well, so yes and no. So the way that this is pulling from Dr. Moeller, who I mentioned. He does talk about this as not a new thing. He's just saying it is the default now. And there were other ways of viewing the self through first order observation. Like if you're I think one of the examples he uses is if you went to a concert, before the proliferation of phones, you went to primarily view the concert yourself, whereas now many people film the concert and take photos. And what those are doing are functioning as a way to present that experience to other people. And so then the way we think about the experience is through the ways other people will perceive the way that we experience it.
Okay. So yeah, that's the common critique around the curated life, the whole Facebook and Instagram effect, where we are judging ourselves based on our experience of what we see other people living without necessarily realizing consciously that what we're seeing of them is their curated life. And we're doing that as well as we post things and express our experiences and parade our life in social media. We're curating it so that we're giving everybody the impression of who we are based on who we ideally want to be, rather than an authentic raw self.
Well, that is a critique, but that is not what Dr. Moeller is, where he goes with that. He sees it at, generally he says it's not better or worse, but it is more complex and beneficial in a way, which I can talk about in a second. But just to continue on the train of thought of second order observation, to flesh it out a little bit more, he argues that we view products in terms of brands and people's in terms of profiles.
Also brands, since we're all branding ourselves now.
Yes, exactly. And that's part of also, I think, identity politics with, Nike, brands like Nike and things take, sort of co-opting social movements and then seeing ourselves as brands in activist settings as well, I think is a big problem. But
view that as sort of a questionable analysis of identity politics and perhaps more of a reflection of the denigration of the concept of identity politics. Whereas identity politics is the identity, the individual identity. You are who you are, whether your identity is rich, poor, gay, straight, goth, preppy, whatever the identity is that informs your politics, rather than it being related to branding or the idea of cultivating an identity to project that, or cultivating enactment to project an identity.
Right. Well, but then the idea is that brands can co-opt that identity and sell it back to you. So then you can say, they like Nike sells a shirt that has like some slogan on it about standing together or helping each other or whatever. And so then that becomes part of your identity. The brand becomes part of your identity because
and that they were friendly to you, or they were the person who was nice to you, or the brand that was nice to you. So you become a fan of theirs, and to a degree a cheerleader of theirs, and then that reflects on how you
see yourself. Yeah.
The snowballing effect there is one feeds on the other.
So, So in this book, authenticity, I kind of mentioned, is presented as the outside reflecting the inside, whereas Dr. Moeller, what he calls profilicity, means authenticity assumes the outside is real and the inside must be invested in it, or the identity is a fraud. So that
sounds kind of like the critique I've made around, when we're talking about people redefining goth as being what they like, or when they're wanting, they're so desperate to be goth for some unknown reason that they're either trying to make what they already like considered goth, or they're doing a lot of things to become goth. It's the idea of, I have these feelings inside and I express them, and that happens to be goth, versus I see this thing of goth, it's aspirational, and I do things to get closer to it. That sort of dichotomy between those two means of identity formation.
Right. Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Okay.
And so then what he's saying though is, I think you're expressing it correctly, but he bestows sort of a self-awareness to the person, to the agent. So he's saying that what this does is make the paradox of essentialism obvious, because if we are all pretending in different ways, right, that sort of, I'm presenting my profile in a certain way so that others will perceive it that way, but I know that's in a way pretending, and they know in a way that's pretending. So it kind of plays a little bit into Judith Butler's performativity. Like we are all pretending, and that becomes the way that we understand ourselves. He says that it makes it more obvious that existence is complex and fluid, which lends itself into seeing the self as more of a spectrum of identities rather than some immutable essence.
Is that going to maybe tie in with, or maybe be something that they're seeing when they're talking about post-subcultural theory or neo-tribalism?
Kind of, but no, I wasn't going to bring that up anymore, because it is like, it's
we have hammered that into the ground pretty heavily.
It sounds, on the face of it sounds like those two things are the same thing, but they're not the same thing.
I just think one impulse can predispose or feed the other, or the perception of the other.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't want to. I'm trying to think how far I want to go into that.
Don't worry, we'll drop it. We'll move on. Right. We have covered that before.
Yeah. So basically, he's saying people today have a better intuitive understanding that there is no true self, and because we're bringing forth our identities in a dynamic way through our, as I said before, like our material reality, our actions, and our relationships, and being able to using that second order observation makes that more obvious. So he says that what this does is it helps us become more at ease with ourselves and our relationships with others, because we all know that we're doing this genuine pretending, as he calls it. And so it creates an easing of identity.
My main issue with that is, I think, as individuals who are curating our lives and putting it out there, I think a lot of the individuals kind of know they're doing it. I don't think people really have internalized strongly enough the knowledge that other people are doing it. I think that's a problem that we're running into as a society with, mental health issues and body image issues and stuff like that, is we may know if we're asked to think about it and intellectualize about it, we might say that, oh yeah, no, I know that their profile is all, they do the same photoshopping and curating and all that stuff, and they dress up for special to do their TikTok and whatever. I think intellectually, if pressed, people will say that they know that, but I don't think they know it. I don't think it's that subconscious side of us that judges ourselves and judges our place in the world, really acknowledges or knows that. And that's why we do have such confusion around identity formation and such confusion around what is normal and what is achievable and attainable as we're seeking to perfect our lives. And it's almost an arms race where, you curate your life, but then you see someone who did it better and you're like, oh, well, if their life and you're subconsciously thinking their entire life is that perfect, God, my curated life isn't even that good. I must be really failing.
Right.
And that's been a part of our current day mental health crisis.
Yeah. And I think he actually agrees with you. I think the positive aspect of that I'm talking about, he presents as the good, like the potential good that Profilicity could have and does have for some people, but he does present other ways that manifests, much like how you're talking. I think one of the examples he uses is of this person who is really invested in climate change and really has this existential dread about climate change. There was a report that came out that said they hacked some server and found that this like huge climate change report was faked and that they had proof of it. And then eventually it came out that wasn't true. And the person who was a climate change, proponent said that they were relieved to find out that the hack was false, whereas which creates a bit of an irony, because you would think if you were really concerned that climate change was going to destroy everyone's lives, you would kind of wish that the hack report was actually true, because then that would relieve some of that existential stress.
Yes and no, but as we talked about identity formation, and if your identity is formed around a core belief in climate change, having that is still an assault on that core belief. Right. And I think that I kind of remember, I don't know if it was that hack, but there was a hack that released a lot of climate data, like internal communications within, I don't remember if it was NOAA or some other climate research thing. And what they were seeing as fraudulent was just the discourse of scientists as they're talking about how do you analyze data? Well, what if we look at it this way? Well, what if we look at it this way? And they read that as massaging the data to get the outcome that they wanted, rather than massaging the data, which is what you do to try to get stuff that's repeatable and is reflecting experienced reality, because data is always going to be an artificial construct. But if you aren't aware of the process,
that's scientific
that
literacy.
Looks like fraud.
Yeah.
Or at least the discussion around it looks like fraud, especially if you come to it with the preconception that the scientists have a narrative that they're trying to force because they get money from that narrative being true, which is usually one of the primary angles of people who are climate skeptics, is that the narrative of climate change is advantageous to the climate scientists who are getting grants and funding and students and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, let's just wrap it up. If you listener or you, Trey, are interested in, I like that second order observation thing. He does have on his YouTube channel, he obviously explains his theory, but he also has several videos where he responds to criticisms or takes questions from YouTube comments and things. So if you're interested in that, again, I'll have a whole bunch of links in there.
I definitely am, because as presented, as you already know, have tons of critiques about it. But if he's already addressed them, that's cool.
Most of the obvious ones. I just don't want to spend like a ton of time.
No,
It's really kind of ancillary to what we're talking about.
It is, and it's a video that already exists. That just pointing it as you can make it your Sinister Suggestion.
Oh, I have a better suggestion than that.
Fair enough. I don't.
Okay. So let's wrap it up. Do you have any overall thoughts about the book or anything?
Not really that I didn't already address. I mean, I thought it was a very interesting book. I will admit here on air that I did not finish it. I do still have a chapter and the conclusion left to actually read through. But it takes a while for me to read a dense academic book while also trying to take notes and pulling out quotes that I can read out on the podcast and stuff. Yeah. While doing other things.
This took me 2.5 months, I think, of working every night during the week to get this mess that you just listened to together.
Right, and of course you also did a lot more too. So I give you props for that because I don't have as much going on as my life, and while I can throw the excuse of executive dysfunction around, which I do struggle with, but isn't everybody dealing with that right now? You know, I got a good feeling for the book. It is good. It's a good book. It's really interesting. I'm actually really excited to get to the last chapter that I haven't read yet because that is the Dark Canon chapter, which when I read through the table of contents was the chapter I was most interested in. So I'm definitely excited to get to reading that, but I just closed the book with my bookmark fell out of it. I know where I was. So
it's like that scene.
I'll probably be taking less notes. Talking the Twilight Zone.
Yeah,
with the
glasses.
Yeah, I thought that's where you're going with that.
All right. Well, then here's my quick conclusion. I absolutely recommend this book. I think it fills a critical gap in written literature about goth. From a theory perspective, it gets the closest I've seen in any academic literature, especially sociological literature, to examining goth through the lens of an ontological multiplicity that eschews epistemic representationalism, and I think that's a step in the right direction. I like that they reject things like structural determinism, which is the idea that you can rationally predict outcomes based on structural analysis. My final thought on enactments is I really like this approach. I do think the nature of these categories will always be more complex and contingent than falling under X number of categories. I agree that goth is consistently distinctive and it is expressed in ways that allow for variation. The way I would phrase it would be to say there is an ontological multiplicity, which means there are a limitless number of dark enactments. I also agree they are brought forth in the context of a historical canon that is dynamic and co-constituted through action taken by agents and the material world around them. And I do really think that interaction between past and present and vice versa is an important consideration. I like that they had that in this book. In the conclusion of the book, they talk about how they like what Honners says in his book about punks, which I haven't read, but I put it on my list because it seems really interesting. I think I would like a lot about it. He says something about moving away from fixed ways of thinking about subcultures into plural structures of meaning. And I completely agree with that. I also think that's something expressed well in activism philosophy. I pulled a quote out of the book Embodied Mind, which is kind of the foundational text for an activist philosophy. A very short 2 sentences. They say, as Buddhist teachers often point out, knowledge in the sense of prana is not knowledge about anything. There is no abstract knower of an experience that is separate from the experience itself. So yeah, I think the authors and I would agree that goth itself doesn't pre-exist but is brought forth. I'm not sure we would agree that process goes all the way down and that what I think is we bring forth the worlds we live in as well, but I'm not going to go into a huge metaphysical discussion about that. I think the practical takeaway is that what this does is it frees us to understand that the ways we can enact our worlds allows us to bring about meaningful change in the world. So if there is a multiplicity of ontologies, then new forms of engagements can give rise to material changes and mobilize spaces of being and existence, which puts forth those enactments that are beneficial and marginalizes or reduces other harmful enactments, which is how we bring about positive change. And I prefer talking about things that way. Like if we're talking about systemic issues like patriarchy, if we see patriarchy as this thing that exists and acts on agents, it's seemingly impossible to change that. But if we see it in this form of either Schottky's flat ontology or these multiplicity of ontologies, creating change becomes much more attainable as a thing to do. And also just that dissolving of binaries, I think, is empowering for positive change and a more accurate way of understanding existence, I think. But all that to say, I think I'm going to say that this is probably, I'm just going to say this is my new favorite academic book on goth. So
one other thing I want to say in addition to what you just said, to maybe assuage concerns of people who might be interested in and are a little bit leery of it, the prose in this book is a lot less turgid. It's actually very well written, and to kind of harken back to that maybe Einstein quote from earlier about, being able to explain things to a 6-year-old or to a layperson. You can read through this book with little to no knowledge of the other books that it references. The references are there if you want to learn more, but they're not relied upon. They're not. It's not a baseline knowledge you have to dig into this book. The author does a very good job, or authors do a very good job of kind of describing in lay terms why they're referencing these things. And a lot of the bulk of the text is anecdotal stories from the people they were interviewing, which is also not an academic standpoint. It's people who lived the experiences and how they described them, with some introductory paragraphs or follow-up paragraphs by the authors on how this works in with their theories. It's very clear and lucid, and I would say it's a good introduction to a layperson to this sort of discourse, without getting into a lot of turgid prose.
The first 2 chapters might be a little intimidating.
Yes, the methodology stuff.
Which is kind of how these books always tend to start.
Skip the methodology stuff unless you really want to get into the how and why they were made, or want to know about that sort of methodology. But once it gets into the actual substance, the meat of their arguments in chapters 3 and beyond, I believe.
The content of the interviews really...
It's much more clear. Yeah. Even the authors' voices are much more clear.
Yeah.
So I am not nearly as steeped in the literature as Danny is, and I had zero problem understanding pretty much everything that the book was talking about. So...
Excellent.
Definitely recommended. I agree with the general consensus here that this is a very good book. And even though it's explicitly about the Italian Goth subculture, as we kind of explained in here, it parallels very well with what we've both read of Goth subculture in the 80s in multiple different geographies.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
Obviously, it's completely unrelated to anything we just talked about. If you want more of that kind of thing, check the links in the notes. The last couple of weeks, I think both of us, I know for myself, but I think both of us have been spending a good chunk of time watching video essays, and specifically video game video essays.
Yeah, I saw the Curio ones. I've been watching a lot of that too.
So I had a couple recommendations. Actually, the first one isn't even a video game video essay, but I just watched it today and it was fantastic. And it is from Curio, and it is titled "The Matrix sequels are good actually." That whole video is about. I haven't seen The Matrix. I like the movies. I haven't watched those movies in like 12 years.
I watched them as they came out, and I haven't rewatched them. I may have seen The Matrix, the first one, more than once. I don't remember. I watched them when they came out. I wasn't that impressed with any of them, frankly. I am curious to see Curio's take on it, though.
Yeah, there were a few. I mean, there was a lot in there. The main thrust was about the films as a queer and trans story, but also as a way to understand the way that fascist and extremist far-right groups take over leftist and communist discourse, and the ways that the movie talks about how we can practically implement sort of class action against capitalistic systems and things like that. Not only is it insightful, but the entire thing is so masterfully written and edited, and it really is like, I've been watching a bunch of these video essays, and that was really a masterwork, I think, of content. So I highly recommend that. And then for video game essays, I've been watching so many of these. The one I'm going to recommend is from the channel Never Knows Best. And probably my favorite I've seen of his so far has been the most recent video, a review of the Mass Effect trilogy in 2021. A good 3-hour video there. Very interesting, but he does have a bunch of other content. He's got a cyberpunk one. We both watched his 3 videos on Elder Scrolls that are like 2 hours each. I would definitely recommend that, because that's basically been most of my free time, or not really even free time, just when I'm working. I've been popping these video essays on. That one that we talked about, that was about Morrowind, that's an 8-hour long video. The one I watched that kind of thing
of theirs that I enjoy was is another recent one, though not as recent as the Mass. It was the Evolution of Supergiant games.
Oh, I haven't watched that one yet.
It's pretty good. I don't know how familiar you are with Supergiant games, if you've played any of them. I've played 2 of them. They're not really my genre. Do you know who Supergiant gamers are, what they're known for?
I don't think I could say off the top of my head.
Bastion was their first one. Then Transistor.
No.
Which of the 2 I played? Although I only played a very small amount of Bastion. I did play a fair amount of Transistor. And then Pyre. It's an indie game company. I know as you've discussed or expressed to me before, that you find it interesting that I tend to gravitate so much for indie games. And you do tend to gravitate generally a little bit more towards...
Yeah, I'm now discovering the joys of indie games, though. I'm really... Especially after, today, you saw the thing that came out about Activision Blizzard today. Yeah. So absolutely fucked up, and just really kind of... And also just as having been a gamer for so long and mostly focused on the big games, I'm realizing there's so much more depth and variety and joy to be found in these like passion projects from small studios or just single people.
Thank you, Cloudpunk.
Yeah, really.
Pretty sure that was your gateway.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I think you're right. All right, very cool. Well, that's it. That's all I got. We also had an album we were gonna review, but I'll throw it in the show notes if anybody wants to check it out. Russian post-punk, if you're interested in that. It's good. Go listen to
it. Yes, it is good. Go listen to it.
You know what, though? In lieu of an entire album review, why don't we play a track off of the album at least? And then I'll come back after the song to let you know what we'll be talking about on the next episode. So let's just play track 8 off of the album. The album is pretty diverse in sound, and I think, Trey, you and I both really liked it. But since we've kind of run out of time here, let's just play a track and call it a night.
Пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо, пошли. Там будет солнце, там будет жара, деревьев сонных застыли аромат. Там будет пусто, даже когда ходят толпы людей. Пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо. Я с тобой там не бывал никогда. Мое лицо в ее огнях содержит запрещенные вопросы ко мне. И глаз твоих закрытых полумрак зовет меня. Пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо. Я с тобой там не бывал никогда. Пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо. Я с тобой там не бывал никогда. Потом, когда стемнеет, я устрою экскурсию в любимые места и покажу тебе достижения народного хозяйства. Пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо. Я с тобой там не бывал никогда. Пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо, пошли на Веренхо. Я с тобой там не бывал никогда.
All right, a classic 3-hour length for this episode of Cemetery Confessions. We'll be back next month with a brand new episode featuring the DJs from Club Nevermore. We're going to be covering a range of topics, so it will be more of a, traditional Cemetery Confessions episode. We're going to be talking about drag and its relationship to goth and gender. We'll be talking about being alternative in the South. And of course, other issues around the experience of being goth, DJing during a pandemic, the relationship of music to the community, and that kind of thing. So I hope you'll return. Again, subscribe whether you're listening on YouTube or Spotify or a podcast app, like Apple Podcasts, whatever it is. And if you would like to get additional content, or just support the show, get bonuses like merch and videos and other bonus podcast episodes, early access to episodes, you can go to patreon.com/cemetery confessions. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time, for spending it with myself and Trey. I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening. And until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.